This is my experiment in sports journalism, a league that's entirely computer generated. Using Madden, I simulated 20 years into the future to create the NFA. All of the players, teams, stats, and standings in this league were derived from whatever Madden's algorithms could come up with once all the real NFL players had retired. Back in high school, I set out to find the stories that were buried in this arbitrary smorgasbord of data. Nearly 4 years of university and one lockdown later, I had built myself a whole sports pocket universe. I even brought some of these computer-generated players to life by hopping in and playing some of the games myself. Here's an example of a player whose story I found really interesting. This is the story of Jared Coffey. He's the starting quarterback of the San Antonio Broncos and the league's reigning MVP. A franchise quarterback is, by way of their title, attached at the hip to their team. It's like nominative determinism. When you're the face of the franchise, the success of your franchise is how you separate yourself from your peers. At Coffey's level, we're not talking about whether they're a good fit for their offense anymore. We're talking legacies here. So before we jump into the Jared Coffey story, we have to learn about the Broncos story. How has this team fared with him under center? And what does the supporting cast look like coming into this new season? These are questions that I have to jump in and analyze using the standings of the past, the team ratings, the rosters, and pull it all together into one coherent story. To tell you that story, I'll talk to you from the perspective of a hypothetical Broncos beat reporter, setting the stage for the upcoming season. This is part one. In part two, I'll talk a bit more about Jared Coffey himself. Okay, here we go. When a team has suffered double the amount of heartbreak as Taylor Swift in the last few years, they become a complete enigma coming into the season, no matter how talented they look on paper. I have zero idea what to expect from the San Antonio Broncos this year. But it sure is hard to bank on them doing much of anything. I just can't follow the lead of some of the other reporters and talk to you as if I haven't been watching the last few seasons. Your average SportsCenter talking head will gush about San Antonio's unstoppable offense and all that they've done to improve on defense, how they just couldn't get the right breaks last season and will definitely clear the hump once and for all this time around.
So just sheerly on quarterback alone, I'm going to win the division. And just by default, my defense is going to be better than it was last year.
I'll be the one to offer you the grain of salt to take as the rest of us shovel that crap down your gullet. 0-4. This team is 0-4 in the playoffs since 2016. Let's take a gander at the franchise's comical track record of squandering some fantastic opportunities. In 2016, San Antonio went 14-2 even though they were missing quarterback Jared Coffey for 6 games. Then they lost their first playoff game in overtime. They went 6-10 the next year with a largely similar roster. The Broncos started the 2019 season 8-0 and finished 10-6. And of course, last season the Broncos looked unbeatable at times with the second best record in the league, only to be stunned in the first round by the 9-win New Orleans Talons. But I get it. It's hard not to make excuses for these guys. San Antonio's demise rarely comes at the hands of a full-scale collapse, quite like the league's other notorious choke artists, see Virginia Beach. There's always an air of dignity to their exit, no matter how surprising. As a high seed, they caught a couple red-hot underdog teams at the wrong time in 2016 and 2018. When the upstart Bobcats and Bulls came to town and toppled Goliath those years, the upsets were egregious at the time, but the bitterness kind of cooled off a bit after both of those teams continued their magical runs to the championship. It's hard to beat the nobody believes in us type teams, and the Bobcats and Bulls were definitely that. San Antonio also put up a damn good fight in each of their 2 most recent losses, treating us to a couple classics even in defeat. So many of their early exits are justifiable in a vacuum. A play or two goes their way, and we could be looking at a totally different story. But these late season disappointments are piling up. The fact remains that the Broncos have had the league's best offense for years now, with absolutely nothing to show for it. And that's all that matters. Maybe it's a sort of team-wide inferiority complex because of their big brother division rival Los Angeles Crusaders. They're the glossy media darling with similar talent and a similar sized market, but much more success. The rivalry between quarterbacks Jared Coffey and Elias Floyd of the Crusaders is more of a scheduled reality check than anything. It's a time-honored American tradition at this point that families gather to watch the Crusaders beat the Broncos on primetime every season. We can always count on Floyd to prove himself the superior quarterback in these head-to-head moments, regardless of the stats or accolades. Jared Coffey won MVP last year, for heaven's sake, yet Floyd still had his number in the end, by beating him twice during the season and eventually going on to win his third title. And that gut punch might have been the final straw. The Broncos had all the offensive firepower in the world and the league's MVP under center, yet again they were so clearly overmatched by the likes of Los Angeles. And I'll give credit where credit is due here. San Antonio finally mustered up the courage to make a change this offseason. They pretty much turned their entire culture on its head. They admitted the current state of affairs wasn't working and committed to a wholesale change in identity, a rather unprecedented move for a team that had just won 13 games. While a huge portion of the cap is still tied up in the star trio of Jared Coffey, James Bell, and Michael Collie, the Broncos got creative in shaking things up on a budget. The attention shifted sides of the ball entirely. San Antonio stripped some key pieces of their electric offense to free cap space and build around these star linebackers on defense. Wide receiver Gerald LaVard, tight end Earl Clarence, halfback Will Rock, and stalwart right tackle Ed Lear have all left town, kicked to the curb in a huge offseason purge with some lofty offensive contracts. In their place, San Antonio brought in defensive studs Korey Jeffcoat, Zach Massey, and Derwin Johnson. For the first time in a decade, the Broncos look to have balanced talent on both ends. Gone are the days of the air-it-out fireworks in San Antonio. They're looking towards building a more efficient, all-around attack for the closing chapters of Jared Coffey's career. The Broncos have a ton at stake this season. It took a lot of guts to uproot a team that's hovered around 10 wins a year since 2010 in order to shift resources to the other side of the ball. If things don't click and the Broncos lose their identity, it could spell the end of an era in San Antonio. But if it works, the Broncos become the championship favorites. Okay, wait a minute. I'm starting to sound an awful lot like the Broncos apologists I started this rant lambasting, aren't I? It's like I'm a Walking Dead character slowly and consciously turning into a zombie. I can feel my brain starting to soften due to this relentless Broncos hype.
Well, shit.
I just know that in a month I'll fall in love with this team again and set high expectations for them in the playoffs only for them to let me down. Please snap me out of it and remind me in October that San Antonio is still 0-4 in the postseason since 2016. Thank you. This was part 1 of 2. In my next video, I'll read from an article on Coffey himself, his legacy, and his role within this team. My first couple videos were about specific players, and part 2 will be more like that. But I'm thinking of doing more of these team-based breakdowns in the future. It's what I found most interesting when following this league through Madden. The individual stories are still there, but it's when you put them into the context of a team is when they get kind of more meaning. If you want to read more about the San Antonio Broncos, their team page on my website has an analysis of every single position group as they head into this important season. I'll link it in the description. I've got 24 other stories just like this in there. I wrote about a novel's worth of content about this computer-generated league, and I'm just starting to chip away at converting it all into this video format. Thanks for watching to the end. I hope you're enjoying this series and the little football universe I created. Have a great one. I'm just now starting to kind of chip away at getting it all into what? Jake, you goob. Call me an idiot.
You're not a goob.
Call me an idiot.
No.
Do it.
No, you're
Do it.
smart.
Call me an idiot.
You're very smart, Jake.